So thank you all for being here early this morning. We are going to discuss Mozilla's Internet Health Report. I'm sure you all have one of these in your pockets. Please switch them to silent, don't switch them off. The hashtag to tweet and get people outside of them involved in the conversation is Internet Health. You can also use Mozilla Mornings, and the three topics, of course, that we're discussing will be hate speech and content moderation, which covers a huge amount of things. We have got Rethinking Digital Ads, which is going to feed back into how we manage our data, and of course AI and all the problems associated with that. So all three of these topics are interlinked, and you'll find them all in this lovely report. There are stacks of them around. If you haven't had a chance to read it, you can also read it online at Save the Trees. But we've narrowed it down to those three topics because we feel it's actually too much to go through in this full report. So take the time to read it yourself when you've got a moment or two. But staying with the report, we have got three wonderful speakers. You can see the details here. I'll introduce them properly in a moment, because to kick us off, we are going to have Solana, who is the Solana Larson from Mozilla, who is the editor of this report, and she's just going to give us a brief overview of what it contains.
Yes, and I'll just go ahead and stand. Good morning. Hi, I'm Solana. Maybe you've had a chance to look at the report already. If not, we do have a couple of copies, but it really is best browsed online. And I say browse because it's not the kind of thing that's meant to be read from one end to another. And despite the fact that it contains the word report in the title, it's also not kind of a technical report or a policy report or something that's very heavy. It's a series of reflections, a compilation of research from many different sources, a very broad overview of where we are with the internet right now. And when we're thinking about what does it mean for the internet to be healthy, what is that? The report is part of trying to define what that means for as many different people as possible. So when we think about, does it function well? Is it good for people around the world? What are the different things that need to be in order for that to happen? What are the different conditions that we could improve to make sure that the internet lives up to the ideals and the aspirations that we have for how it could make the world better? And I think a lot of us who work on the internet, either professionally or who maybe just use it for one specific aspect of our lives, whether professionally or for entertainment, we're very focused on one area, and we sometimes don't see the forest for all the trees. We don't see it as an ecosystem that is global, that is affected by what happens in one end. We don't see how the efforts we have to influence the internet in one direction or another, what impact that has for others. We don't always see how the actions that perhaps we're taking in one country or in one region to improve the internet or to make something work better, what effect that has all the way around the world. And so to draw those parallels and those connections, we created the Internet Health Report as a kind of a convening space to bring together a lot of different ideas. We asked the general public to tell us what they care about, what they would measure if they wanted to measure if the internet was getting healthier. And they said things like, tell us how much hate speech there is in the world, or tell us how much censorship there is, or tell us how much disinformation there is. And given the roles that you have, you know that these are things that are nearly impossible to calculate on a global scale, in all languages, for all people. But there are bits of research in different parts of the world that tell parts of the story. And we know that there are trends, and we know that there are initiatives to make things better or worse, depending on what information we have available about the condition, the situation that we're in. And so those are the types of research that we bring together. We listen to the hundreds of people who contacted us, who participated in figuring out what should go into the report. And then we also convened a community of internet researchers, of people who work on policy, of members of Mozilla staff, from those of us who work in communications and nonprofit kind of activities, and those who work on the daily, coding and programming of browsers and other new technologies. We bring together these different perspectives and try and figure out consensus on what should happen. What would it mean for the internet to be healthier? And that's part of this journey that we're taking in every year publishing a new internet health report that tells us something about the state. So we published the 2019 report about 2 weeks ago. It's very fresh. The English version was published. We're launching the Spanish version today. The French version will come next, and the German version will follow in June. For each of the different language events, we have local partners where we'll be launching reports and having conversations like these with people like you to understand how are the ideas in it received, what should we think about putting into the next version, how can this vision of an internet as an ecosystem be helpful to our work? How can we begin to think of ourselves as capable of making the internet better? I think a lot of what we get from news headlines is a sense of pessimism, a sense of depression, a sense that the problems are too big, that we won't be able to fix things. And this report, and in working together with people around the world who are doing things to make the internet better, is supposed to be a constructive way of thinking together about what can be done and the celebration of the things that are being done by lots and lots of people. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspectives and perspectives of our panelists, and just want to thank you for taking the time to listen.
Thank you very much, Solana, and thank you for the report. Even if you have to look into it, it's really interesting reading, and there's lots of little facts that you can use to tell to friends and families and colleagues who don't get it, maybe. And Solana, we're going to stay there. And I do want the conversation in the room to be quite free-flowing, so if you want to add something, I've seen the list of all the attendees. I know you all know this stuff, so just catch my eye, put your hand out if there's something that you want to add. But let's start now with our three speakers. We have Prabhat Agwal, who is the Deputy Head of Unit in the E-Commerce and Platforms Department in the European Commission, that's part of DG Connect. We have next to me Mark Surman, who is the Executive Director of Mozilla Foundation. And last but not least, Claudine Leugen, who is Telecoms and Digital Affairs Attaché at the Perm Rep of the Netherlands to the EU. Claudine, since you ladies first, I'm going to ask you, give us a little bit of background. I mean, Solana said there that we're kind of trying to look at ideas and aspirations today, so let's not be too negative. Give me your perspective.
Oh, yes. Well, thank you first of all for inviting me. And just to give you a small anecdote, we always call our capital if we get an invitation to speak, and they say, "Oh, I've got a great invitation from Mozilla," and they say, "Okay, what's it about?" I say, "It's about the internet." Oh, that's big. Well, now when you talk about, you can say so many things about the internet, and then we, of course, and through your report, we read it, and they said, "Oh, okay, there are quite some linkages with our plans and ambitions of the Netherlands." So I'm quite relieved, and I'm actually full of confidence. I can tell you some plans, things we think is very good for the Netherlands. First of all, we are quite optimistic on the internet and also on all digital developments for the Netherlands. We see it as an opportunity for growth, as an opportunity for prosperity. I think in Europe we are looking for ways to keep our level of welfare or increase our level of welfare. And we think as Netherlands that innovation, especially innovation in the area of internet, in digital development, is a very good opportunity to achieve this higher level of welfare, to achieve this higher level of sophistication in our society. And for the Netherlands, we are very much aware that we are in a global arena and that we need to be a competitive player on the global level as Europe. So we pay a lot of attention to staying globally competitive. So we really see it as an opportunity. We think innovation in new technologies, and amongst others, AI is very important. We should stay together as Europe. We should cooperate. We should invest in not only in monetary terms but also in effort in these new technologies. And in the end, on the sharing side, we think it's very important to have a trustworthy internet, a trustworthy digital environment, and we want to stress the importance of cybersecurity and the importance also on privacy concerns, because we also see an important element is the data economy. So these are this is our main focus also for the new European Commission. So I'm also very interested in what the parents want to tell us. As a short introduction, this is where the Netherlands stand.
Okay. Thank you very much. How about that? Let us hear what's going to happen in the new commission.
If only I knew. Somebody's going to tell me. So, look, I'm going to share some ideas about things that we are talking about internally and what we're thinking about. Yeah, maybe I just say a couple of words first about how I read this report and how it comes across my desk. I mean, just a bit of background is that I kind of was in school and I was there when the internet was born. I was doing an internship at one of the German accelerators, and it was very soon after they kind of linked up CERN and the German accelerator. And I was just kind of like, wow, what is this? And I thought this is not going to useful for anybody. Who's going to use this slow link? Like the no information bandwidth. And forget it. And so now they.
So we should rely on your predictions.
Exactly. Now they put me in charge of this stuff. Just I think that one of the things that from my early experience, and also I'm one of the few kind of technical people around in the commission, scientist by background, and I've worked as an engineer also in the high tech industry before joining the commission, is that I think that Mozilla as a kind of part of the ecosystem is really an important player. And I think, let me just stress that, in an environment where there's kind of so many interests and complex business and non-business and civil society interests and so on. It's really nice to see. I was one of the first ones to use the Netscape browser, and I still recall the transition to it. So I think that they kind of comes from a vantage point which is particularly valuable, and I think this is reflected in the report because it offers a landscape which we don't really see often. So congratulations to a really rich, factual and evidence-based report, which is kind of honest in the sense that it doesn't skip over the complexity of the issues. And I think that this is something that's really very important as well. It doesn't, it tries to embrace the complexity of the issues, and that's really valuable, but it's also pretty scary, because like you say, in many of the issues we'll be discussing in a minute, there are no kind of super easy answers to some of the issues, like and in many cases, the answer is let's understand first what's going on and before taking a step. So now to answer your question, what are we thinking about in the next commission? And I think that this is a period where it's not a secret, we are reflecting about what we're going to put on the menu for the next mandate. And as every time, we are proposing a range of options, depending on who comes and what the political appetite is going to be by the next commission, from kind of business as usual kind of options to very extreme and very radical options as well. So at the moment we're scanning the whole thing. I think the areas that are under my responsibility, is the status of intermediaries, the advertising ecosystem, we want to understand a little bit what's going on also in news services. One of the things that I loved in this report was this idea of platforms that are actually owned by the platform workers, platform participants. This is something that we are thinking about. How can we stimulate this more? So we're taking a pretty broad view, and these are some of the ideas, and we can go on in more details at this moment. And this report has been actually one of the few reports that kind of resonates with the breadth of views that we're trying to take inside the house as well. Other ideas that we are kicking around at the moment are issues around how can we kind of promote some more innovative services. A lot of talk about regulatory sandboxing. We're taking a closer look at issues on algorithmic transparency and AI in general. So this is kind of just such a wide menu, and it's reflected in some of the reports issues here as well. It doesn't mean that necessarily we will propose regulation on each of these, so just to preempt a question that I'm sure we're going to get in a second, But we are taking a close look, and we're trying to understand the issues internally, and we're having a lot of internal brainstormings and discussions on these issues. So this report is just that.
Okay, thank you. Mark, your take on the initial sort of overview of the whole report. Inspired or terrified?
Both. I think, like Pravat, I made some wrong predictions in my life, but the opposite ones. And so when I was working in basically sort of activist and public television, very much, I think one of the things that inspires me is to think about that goal of having that civic welfare. And we actually have a history of that. I'm Canadian in Canada and in most places in Europe, of saying, we want media to have a civic purpose and actually not just serve commercial ends. And so that's where I had started my career, was really, I'm old enough when we had big television cameras and very few people had email and all these things. And I saw that first webpage, the ones coming out of CERN and into Mosaic, or links, even the text-based precursor to Mosaic. I was like, this is going to do what we have not been able to do in kind of public media. It's going to democratize everything, and everybody's going to have so much free speech, and this is going to be amazing. And some of that happened. In fact, a lot of that happened. But the place we are now, that those of us who were doing internet stuff in the mid-90s and who really, I spent my whole career basically as an open internet activist of one way or another, that we would be in this place with misinformation, that we would be in this place with a thing that we thought was a great tool for democratizing things, would raise so many questions about whether we can even sustain our civic space and our democracies, that we didn't predict. And at the same time, there's a lot to celebrate, whether that's the kind of economic boom for individuals as well as kind of new companies we never could have imagined that has come from the kind of open innovation of the internet, or just like the personal thing. I mean, the friendships I have around the world that I'm connected to people through the internet and can sustain, never could have imagined that either 25 years ago. And I think that goes to then your question, and that we struggled over what would be the headline of the blog post that I wrote, sort of announcing this year's report. And it's kind of boring, but the headline was, "It's complicated." And that's, to me, actually the exciting difference that I see, and I hear it in your reactions, both of your reactions, especially some of what you said about how you guys use the report. From a year ago to now, the biggest change to me is the number of people who are seriously investing in the idea that it's complicated. And so digging into that, we actually need to roll up our sleeves and figure out that the regulatory paradigms we have from the past, whether that's copyright or broadcasting or even early internet regulation, they're not fit for purpose of where we are right now. And at the same time, we're stuck with this internet thing, until something incredibly dramatic happens to humanity. I think, we're going to be digital. And so we better figure it out. We better figure out how we want to live with this stuff, how we want it to be, how we might regulate it. Once we regulate it, as Europe has, how do we enforce that? How do we do that in a way that gets us the outcomes we want and leads to that kind of welfare, which I think having that intent and then digging in and trying to take it somewhere, that's actually a powerful thing if we can follow through on it. And I actually, on that level, feel more optimistic than I did a year ago or 2 or 3 years ago. That I do think we're, this room is full of people who are digging in and trying to take things in the right direction.
Okay, well, let's use that as our jumping off point. It's complicated. In order to deal with all of these areas, do we somehow need to unravel some of that complexity in order to understand? And let's start with, I said we're going to break this into 3 specific areas. Let's start with online content moderation.
We're going to start with the easy one.
Okay, hey, we're finishing with AI.
Much easier.
Okay, well, let's start with you. So how do we even go about defining the content we consider to be problematic or that needs more of our attention when there's so much content out
You're asking me.
there? I'm asking you. I'm going to ask all of our panelists. But
Well, I actually think that defining it is not that hard, right? I mean, again, Canada and Europe are similar. It's harder in the U.S., I think, because we have definitions of hate speech, and we've been through decades and decades. And we can even go into deeper traditions of figuring out where's the balance between free speech and other rights, the discrimination or actual threats of violence or actual violence. I mean, we know that these are things that have to be balanced, and we look at how they're balanced in human rights frameworks and other kinds of legal frameworks. So I think that part's not hard. I think what's hard is then if at scale we've enabled a kind of free speech that we never imagined as we wrote these frameworks, we want to then figure out how do we make that balance. And then we've leaned towards free speech in the design of these systems, and that's still something that I stand behind and Mozilla stands behind. I mean, that is a great thing that the internet brought. I mean, if you think back to who owned and controlled speech 25 or 50 years ago, was a very small number of people in terms of being able to reach an audience. So that's a good change in society. How you balance that with other rights and protections, that's the complicated part. And one of the things, if we look at the NetsGG, the piece in the Internet Health Report says, well, it kind of hasn't had much effect. So that's sort of the early news on it. But I think that the critical piece is there's no transparency into what Google and Facebook have actually taken down. And so there's no ability to actually understand what's going on there. And so I really think it's a kind of a boring answer. But we actually need to be able to have researchers and governments look into what's going on in detail to figure out, is it getting better? Is it getting worse? What's the nature of the content that people are trying to confront? So I really think, and I'll say this probably across all of them, the boring and real answer in this one is a lot more meaningful transparency that we can use to see what's going on, to figure out how to act, is one of the most urgent needs.
And I'm sure most people here know it, that NetsDG is the German law that's in last year, was the end of the year, saying manifestly unlawful material must be taken down within 24 hours after notification. There's some problematic issues with that in terms of timing and so on, but does the Commission look at these specific member state laws and say, hey, what can we learn, what can we maybe appropriate?
Yeah, I mean, so we were involved in the NetsDG discussions right from the beginning and worked with the German government, and we were a little bit surprised that they proposed it. And because at EU level, colleagues had been engaged in a kind of self-regulatory mode with some of the companies, and that seemed to be evolving in a kind of the right direction. But maybe one thing that's important is just kind of, I think the one thing that I've learned in talking to people in member states, who are behind the SDG and in Germany, or the recent proposals in France, which are going to come up. Last week there was a report by French officials on this so-called mission Facebook, and then there's also a French parliamentary proposal for a law, which is in a way similar to kind of the SDG kind of approach. But just and we've been also involved in the kind of terrorism regulation and maybe one thing that is important to stress, and I think, is what is behind these laws. What's kind of what is driving the desire to kind of come in. And I think that when you listen to people in this domain, I think that's an important thing, is that a lot of people feel, and this is reflected in kind of is the internet safe kind of part here. There's a kind of massive threat on the internet in terms of, and that's related to kind of speech-related issues. In Germany, it was a kind of a kind of fear of a wave of anti-immigrant sentiment, which was kind of playing out, on social media and with kind of allegations of kind of migrants raping people and false news as well, but also kind of a lot of hateful content, which would have been illegal under German kind of criminal codes, but which kind of Facebook wasn't taking down, as they say that all terms of conditions apply, and this material doesn't come clean, and you have to take this to court in Ireland because that's where we're based, and then the Germans kind of scratch their heads and say, what's going on here? And this is really kind of an issue we have. we have this huge wave of xenophobic violence, and this material is kind of going on. Similar, if you talk to the people who've been pushing very hard around terrorism regulation, like particularly people in France or the UK, what were the concerns behind it? There's France that said, there were Daesh videos in French with instructions on YouTube on how to kill people and how to carry out a terror attack. And for French society, it's simply not acceptable that this material was there. And if they then get a response saying, "Oh, but this doesn't really violate our terms of service," that doesn't really cut it, right? And that created a kind of an atmosphere and say that a lot of people said, well, this isn't working, here that, people are killing people in our countries. They're obviously trying to radicalize people, and we can't just leave it up to you to decide what's going on. So I think it's important to understand that these are underlying issues, whether then what the path that has been taken in terms of regulation is the right path or not, this is something we can debate. But I think it's very important to understand the underlying sense of insecurity and also sense of disempowerment of such people towards their perceived inability to protect people who should be protected online, and the discomfort with delegating that role of protecting it to someone else. And I think that driver is really helpful. I think some of this I see back here. And transparency is, of course, just to come back to that point, is a very important vector in understanding what's going on, There's only a partial response to the sense of protection that is needed. And we're big fans of transparency and greater transparency. It's also interesting to note, I think this is something that, I kind of maybe a comment that I would have just pointed out is that originally the transparency reports that Google and Facebook a little bit later were publishing were kind of meant to hold governments to account. And it's kind of interesting to see this about turn, where these reports are now being used to hold platforms to account. So this shift in accountability about who's holding whom to account, this is also an underlying driver that's changing. So I think I'll just leave it there, and just in terms of views, and I think that we're benefiting from a relative, moment of calm. I don't know, just to kind of also go back to the roots of these issues and to kind of see what is underlying. And one of the interesting things around the Christchurch call, which is going to be published tomorrow, following the shooting in Christchurch, was that actually there was a kind of increased recognition that the internet is kind of, that what happened online was kind of very intimately linked to what happened offline. And I think this is a relatively recent realization, where regulators have been kind of treating kind of the online space as a kind of something that really needed to be brought in line. But now I think we see much more interlinkages. And I think that's also something that we are keen to further in the next work, and just not to kind of take online platforms as an entity separate and apart from what's happening offline. And that's an important part.
Wanting to, not to get stuck into too much specific laws, but in general, how much are you thinking about, we talk about the gatekeepers of the internet, and often it's kind of, nobody really wants to hand private, policing over to private entities that are in, frankly, the business of making money. But to flip that on its head, is it useful to us in some ways that there are a few very big platforms that we can say, well, if we can actually get you to do the job of sorting this out, we've covered 90% of the problem?
Now, I think for the Netherlands, we are not yet at that step. We are even a step before, and it's interesting what Private says about understanding the underlying concerns and doing something with that. We see you cannot make a general judgment and solve the problem in one way, or that's extremely difficult. And where the Netherlands is quite worried about this, maybe we have some cases which are very clear what we want to do and what we as a society should do, but there will be also a gray area in, should we get content online, or should we not do that? And then the second question would be, who should be responsible for doing that? But I think in the Netherlands we're even a step on before that. We are still very cautious. There's a lot of discussion on this. do see the cases where there's a very clear reason behind, okay, we don't want this online and we should do something about it and keep it offline. However, we are very cautious to make some kind of a general approach to it. I'm avoiding the word rule. So, and we are looking for solutions on these great cases, and we are thinking about maybe we need some awareness rising that does everybody understand that what's on the internet is not always true, and that you have to check your sources and don't take everything as seriously, and that some things are opinions. But this discussion is still very ongoing in the Netherlands, and we are very cautious to take very general steps for, well, and look whether we can more target to specific cases where it's very clear what we should do. But really be careful with the gray area zones, and but it's different. I mean, it's very difficult because you also see this feeling of insecurity or unlawfulness, and that of course we want to do something about it. We want to take the cautious approach, and also about who should be doing this. I think in the end you need. From one hand, the government should be involved. The government should say, okay, this is the rules which you apply. On that, you don't want the government too involved because you have the freedom of speech, and there's also a dilemma in that sense. But I have to say, we're also still thinking about it and discussing it. These kind of discussions help also, and the report helps with this discussion.
Well, when we come to these grey area cases, it's obviously it's much more difficult to make a decision. Do sort of deadlines, like 1 hour terms, 24 hours here for hate speech, do these sorts of deadlines help or hinder the decision making process?
Well, I mean, I would really applaud that kind of caution of going into it and like dealing with complexity. And I think different countries, whether it's here in Europe or elsewhere, are dealing with it in different ways. But that's the way we would go at it, is to think about how do we kind of tackle the whole problem. And I would say that kind of jumping to take it down in an hour, at least I would argue, if we were having a debate, that's not the right way to rush in and regulate it.
Things like the Christchurch videos, I mean, that was watched hundreds of thousands of times within half an hour.
It's not to say that it shouldn't necessarily come down quickly, but I think the regulatory approach should be much more of a process than about what the outcome is. So, if you got enough and the right content moderation systems, for example, one thing you might really want to push for, whether it's making rules or not, is that the companies invest properly in this, that they've got enough content moderators who can speak the language in the countries that they operate. That they actually have got humans who've got good judgment saying, gosh, let's take that video down until we can actually make it a decision. To do that with a blind instrument of law, a specific outcome, you're not going to have a system that's adaptive enough or is invested in the right way. So I think that's where we actually have to work with whoever the players are. I would love if they were co-ops owned by the users, but now the big companies, where governments I think have to work with the companies to figure out what are the adaptive systems that can balance the threats to, and the free speech piece of it. And then, the other underlying piece that we'll, I'm sure, get to soon is some of this is actually the underlying business model that we actually have to resolve, right? And why it's seen so many times is we have an amplification system built into these platforms that's designed to get as many people watching whatever is going to keep their eyeballs on ads. And it turns out that incredibly sensational content like that one, the systems, even if the platform doesn't want that content, the systems they designed amplify that stuff. I mean, that didn't start on Facebook. It started on 8chan, which, like, how many people have heard of 8chan before? Right? It's a very tiny, racist website, privately funded. Like, Facebook is not the creator of that information. That's not where the Christchurch shooter started. That's the amplification mechanism. The amplification mechanism works because you've got something that's looking for eyeballs. And so getting to those underlying issues actually is really critical.
I mean, obviously, I mean, you're saying don't use blunt tools to do a surgical job. I mean, but one of the ways that, companies can be influenced to act in a specific way is by the rather blunt instrument of fines. I mean, that's what something has to do. That's what we may see with the EU moves going forward. But let's take something like the disinformation code, whereby Facebook has said, coming up to the European elections, we're going to take this very responsibly. We have hired 40 more people in our Dublin office to monitor all of the EU elections. That's not even 2 people per country. But there's no threat of a fine there, so they're not really incentivized to do more. I mean, how do you do that? Do you agree or do you not agree with that?
The questions are getting easier and easier. Yeah. So I think that well, let's just rewind. I think I want to pick up on what Mark said. I think so. I started saying that let's understand the underlying concerns and the societal concerns, and they're free speech concerns. Of course, it's not only about being threatened online and so on. And the difficulty, of course, is in balancing. I think that then once we have a clear understanding of what is driving the concerns, I think that the next step is not to go straight to the content moderation system and the fines. I think that the next step is the right step is to understand the incentive profiles that are out there. And I think that this is so it's already complex to understand the underlying societal concerns. Just sorry to harp on about it. But I think that there are a lot of not understood kind of things. I mean, like one of the areas that is in my remit is also we haven't talked about is child sexual abuse material. It's just completely incomprehensible for most people why this material even exists in the first place. Let alone about how how it spreads or how it's so there there's in the radicalization on terrorist propaganda. I think that there's a kind of generalized also difficulty understanding why are people being radicalized. After the second, third generation immigrants. Who are kind of still watching kind of hate preach on it. So there's kind of a lot of stuff that we don't understand in society. This kind of manifests itself somehow on the internet. But the deeper root causes are very difficult to really fathom. Then comes the next layer of complexity is what Mark just alluded to, is that what is the incentive profile out there? And I think what I loved in this report was this was the division of the big 8 into 3 different categories, and the attention merchants, the machine sellers and the retailers, and because I think that it helps us also think through what are the different incentives of underlying business models, in actually spreading or sharing content and so on, and maybe actually we need nuanced responses depending on what actually their incentive profiles are, and partly this is reflected in the work that the French have done, when they talk about content accelerators, which is kind of the work that these are just incentivized to spread material as quickly as possible. So then, if we get and to be honest, I find this quite complicated, because it's not just a single company, it's not a single service, and the Christchurch meeting has kind of shown it. This is kind of, and we want to keep the internet open, but it also means that material moves around very quickly, So this is something I think that these understandings and these business models are also evolving. By the time that the Commission has kind of convened an internal workshop, Facebook has already announced the third version of its business model. So we're also playing catch up in a lot of these in a lot of these things, which in a way that doesn't really exist in the energy sector or in the telecom sector. Where business models don't change so quickly, right? At least it's my prejudice. So that's it. Then we come to the issue. Okay, once we have understood those, then what are the lever points that we have on this? And the lever points may actually not be just simple takedowns and fines. And they modify. So the obligations to take down and the obligation to fine, and the threat of fines, they're intended to modify the incentive profile. That's it. They are blunt instruments because all you have is a hammer and everything is like an empty, right? And so. But these are the instruments that we have, and so, well, let's take a fresh look, and this is what we're doing now, at what are the incentive profiles and how can we how can we approach it, where should we approach, And I think my prejudice is that the lever points are very different for disinformation and political advertising than they are for terrorist content. They're not the same they're not the same levers. They don't have the same impact in things. And just on the 1 hour thing, just one nuance which sometimes gets lost, but I think it is important, is that the proposal that was tabled by us was not 1 hour removal starting from a user flag, where it was 1 hour from a kind of injunction type notification from a company. So tech is that it's closer to what you would imagine from an injunction kind of system. There are debates about whether it has lawfulness that's necessary for an injunction. But it's not just take it down from a 1 hour once you click the button and report this. This is not what was intended. So that would have been that would have had a very different free speech profile impact. Of course, we can debate whether the 1 hour quasi injunction has negative side effects.
I think that is a good point for us to step on, move on from the content moderation side to the rethinking digital ads business model. You both talked about the questions here for incentivizing certain sorts of content. No advertiser really wants to be most advertisers would say wants to be advertising alongside some horrible hate-filled content. So, let's talk about the business model. Claudine, why don't you tell me your perspective on how this whole landscape ecosystem works?
Whole landscape works. Well, I have to say that for us, if you look to the advertising business, it's about the data, and we actually think that a large part of the businesses outside the advertising do not use enough data. On the other hand, you can also question the use and importance of data in the advertising business. Is this still functioning properly? So I think it's a question, a more general question about how should we use data and how should we get enough flows of data to reap the benefits of it. And of course, advertising has benefits of it, reaping broader societal benefits. And we also think that a lot of businesses don't use data enough and don't share data enough. And on the other hand, keep a very high level of protection and control on data. It's difficult to say from the people who own it because we didn't solve the question who is the owner of the data, but we at least think there should be control on the data on the citizen side, also on the business side.
And we're talking about different sorts of data here. What happens to personal data? We don't want that to be massively widely shared. It's sort of the bigger data than the non-personal identifiable data.
If you look to that we think that a deeper look from the Commission on how the advertising business works would be very beneficial by understanding, okay, what happens there and how does it influence how we think about regulation. Because there's so difference between the advertising business using a lot of data and a lot of companies don't use enough data. The same piece of regulation or ideas seem to have work differently. Where we might want to keep the first about data a little bit more down in advertising business, we want to increase and stimulate it in other businesses. So I think this is quite, I'm just not sure. For me, it's difficult to understand. Okay, you make a piece of legislation which is applicable to all businesses, but they work differently. We are actually on the stand that we want to promote the use and data sharing between companies, cross-border and cross-sectoral. But we would also welcome a more study about, okay, how would this work for advertising? Because there you might want to say, okay, the use and maybe the value of data has been overestimated, maybe. So I think this is a direct question for the Commission, maybe for Carlot, maybe you can answer it also. It would help at least governments to have this general approach and stimulating and maybe getting the first bit down on the other side, or yeah, to get it. I mean, you see, it's quite complicated for us because as a government, we are not really allowed to say, okay, you should do this, you should do that. We make also some general legislation, and it's very difficult to make data if you going to be very specific, targeting one sector. You need a really good public interest why you want to protect or regulate something. Yeah, this would be very much welcome by the Netherlands.
Before I get you to sort of tackle some of those questions, well, I'm going to ask you to pull back even further and just question whether the advertising-driven business model where everything's free, momentarily at least at the beginning, is actually the right model for our current functioning internet. I like the small questions.
Well, it's complicated. So, I mean, for, I don't know, 100, 150 years, you could argue longer. Big parts of the media have been funded by advertising in many parts of the world, and how much proportion is public money versus advertising money is different in different places. But like, it's not new that we try to give people content for free or for cheap using advertising. And certainly Mozilla isn't against that. I mean, I think we will have advertising as a part of the business model of the internet, whether they get supplemented by subscriptions or even public media, or we should be asking those questions about the business model mix on the internet. But advertising isn't going away. We don't think it should go away. The question is, what is ethical and healthy advertising, and how do we want it to work? And so when we talk about it's the business model, which again, that's another thing that in the last 1 or 2 years. When we think of progress in the Internet Health Report, that's a much more common question or a much more common observation. Or even the hunger for that information, I think, is fairly new. That's progress because we are digging into what do we want. And as people ask that question, we're not talking about a little bit of data used to guess whether you want an ad for cooking equipment or sports equipment. We're talking about massive and complete profiling of everything about us, and then inference and deepening of that profiling. We're talking about tracking us across everything we do, whether it's the phone in our pocket and location information, it's all of the websites that, if we're logged into Facebook, it's seeing across all of these sites, it's tracking us and building a profile. And so that version of targeted ads with some super pervasive profiling, which then also leads to everything from abuse of that system and how the targeting works to leakage of that system, which Cambridge Analytica is the most famous case, leakage and abuse of that system. There's lots of side effects. That is something that we really need to tackle and change. It's just egregious and exploitative of our data and used in ways that I think has all kinds of negative side effects. So digging into how do we want that to work, which could involve regulation. Certainly could involve, in fact, it should involve at the national level, using the GDPR and the regulation we have to understand this. I mean, enforcement of the GDPR, to me, is one of the most interesting research activities we can undertake, because then we actually have to deal with real cases. The use of sensitive data is in there. And how many cases are sitting in BPAs right now that are about the use of sensitive data? We don't know, but that's a good way to dig in and figure this stuff out. And then actually just starting to build stuff. We're trying to look at smart tracking protection and other things that are in technology that would help us reduce that footprint. And we did a little thing with this Facebook container, so if you're logged into Facebook and Firefox, it stops the cross-site tracking. But we need technology like that really across the whole internet ecosystem. So I would say we're against the way it happens now. We want to shift how it's happening now, but we're going to have ads for a long time. Let's just do it better.
So this is a really interesting but also a really difficult area, and so we're going to publish soon in a couple of weeks, I think, the first kind of report on algorithm transparency in the online ad system, and which is basically just a factual kind of analysis of and we commissioned this particular report because we knew that we needed more insights into how the actual advertising system works. it's an interesting thing because it's kind of, I think, to my knowledge, it's only kind of one of the first few fully automated markets. After algorithmic trading on the stock market, this is the second example that I know of. I mean, there may be others, which is fully automated buying and selling, and it happens in milliseconds. And the analogy with the stock market is actually quite interesting because so it's not totally new. So on high frequency trading has been around for a while, and this is something actually we have regulated. Also, algorithmic trading is regulated in the EU. So they're in the markets and financial instruments directive and so on. So it's not kind of we have to throw our hands up in the air and say we don't have to say anything. Let's stick our heads into this and run away. And so it's not totally a new object, but it requires a special treatment, deep understanding about the technology. And we are also a little bit similar to Mark. I mean, nobody wants to kind of get rid of the advertising-based business model per se, but it needs to be privacy compliant. The GDPR compliance issues, and we were following very closely the complaints that have been filed in the UK and Ireland around real-time bidding and the spreading of personal data in the bidding process. That's something we're very interested to see. Like on those are things that I heels, and I just have no idea why. Why? How crap is this technology? And after also, I kind of have this, dual thing that they, on the one hand, I think this is really kind of terrible, and the potential of this is really terrible, and on the other hand, it also seems very ineffective, So I don't, that's something, but it's certainly something we're taking a close look at. I think that there is the added angle that you alluded to earlier, is about political advertising, which is kind of a subcategory, but it is important that we get this straight and that we understand. And again, I think transparency is a really important factor, but also careful understanding of what's going on. I think this was actually one of the parts of the report where I had sent a lot of emails to colleagues saying, hey, we have this report on our radar and so on. So. That was very, very rich, but it's also a complex ecosystem. So we're still in the kind of certainly in the analysis phase. I take your point about what data sharing is permissible here in the regulation that we had on platforms of business. Some of this is addressed, not all of it, because we actually one of the challenges in the digital advertising system is who is the object of your regulation. Because there's so many different people involved and so many different who's actually the bearer of a responsibility or an obligation, or who's the bearer of a right. It's not actually super easy to say, and so of course data subjects are bearers of rights on the GDPR and so on, but this requires more careful thinking and thinking through, and I think that this is something that is ongoing, and we also are working with the Joint Research Center in the European Commission, who also have been doing some great work in this. So a learning phase here, and also, but again, an echo of concerns, of what adjustments are necessary actually to make this a more sustainable, more trusted kind of motor and also there are things that are not mentioned here, which are kind of also in my mind. Micropayments never really took off. Like the Peter Sunde, Flatter and so on. Interesting to know why they didn't take off. I've said it to others before. I think. Including people in the room, is that I'm not sure that I fully understand what led to the failure of the do not track standard, and because there have been attempts on in this direction, in the past. So let's also learn from what hasn't worked. Ad blocking is still a big thing, and it's going to probably be a big thing in the next couple of years. Those are kind of things around the issue of digital ads. That I think we can also learn from the experience and to take them on board as part of this reflection.
Okay, I don't want to go too far down the political advertising rabbit hole because in your elections, there's so many events you can attend on that. But let's just very briefly touch on it because it is important. It's one thing for that to be missold a pair of high heels. It's quite another to be missold a government. So your thoughts on that, Mark? Do we need different rules for specific categories of advertising?
It certainly is one thing to be missold the government, and what we've seen with misinformation and the ability to use. And it's not even just misinformation. Like I think what effectively is dangerous or unethical targeting, or targeting based on sensitive data that by the GDPR you shouldn't be able to target people on. There's a broad set of issues. But I think those sets of issues start to show up in algorithmic ad targeting in lots of places. So do I want to be missold the government? Do I want to be offered a payday loan because I'm poor? Do I want to be targeted with a job ad or excluded from a job ad based on my race or my gender? There's lots of stuff that goes on with profiling that and how ads are targeted that I would be just as concerned about as bad election ads. And so I think bad election ads are seeing and the need then to have transparency around them so we can understand what to do, which the code of practice is about, and kind of we have a test case here. That's actually something, that kind of transparency around how ads work is something I predict, and certainly would argue we're going to want across the targeted ad and algorithmic ad ecosystem. And what we've seen, when we think about transparency being needed, it's not just a throwaway term. It's like, can we actually see what's going on to understand how we would ask the companies to do it differently? And what we've seen with the code of practice and the U.S. midterm elections is that the efforts by the companies to respond with transparency let us look into political ad databases. I don't know, maybe it's going a little bit too far to say they're a joke, but they're not very fulsome, to say the least. And so we actually put out a kind of scorecard looking at a bunch of those. And I would say to me, the one that matters the most is having an API that is good, that is useful, that allows us, allows the public, allows government, allows researchers to see what's going on, both on the content of political ads and on the targeting of political ads. And both Google and Facebook failed on that. Like the APIs that are there just don't provide the information we need to see. So I would say political ads important, but really a test case, because we're going to want to be able to see transparently how those ad targeting algorithms work pretty consistently across the system, so that we can look at, are the companies acting ethically, and if not, how do we push them in that direction?
A last specific question on sort of advertising before we get into broader algorithmic questions. You were talking about the value of advertising. What about the value to the actual end advertiser? Many of them have no more insight into how the whole ecosystem works than we, the advertised at. And there are all sorts of horror statistics out there that, by the end of next year, the internet will be 80% bots talking to each other. So what about, can we actually come at this from the other side? It's like we need to give value to the advertisers.
Well, I think this is also related to Robert's remark that advertisement doesn't seem very effective, because I often get ads for costumes, and like male costumes. Like, what did I wrong? Which cookies did I send off? To be honest, I don't have an answer for that. But it seems quite strange that there's so much discussion, a lot of fierce discussion on advertisement and the use of data for advertisement. Well, the value seems quite minimal, and that's really. We can do a lot more with all kind of ways, and therefore we think it's absolutely important that people trust the internet and trust what is done with data. But we are not going to, we are not stimulating there for the advertisement business alone. I think it's a commercial business, and we will be interested in how does it work and how, why do they pay so much for it? That would be an interesting question. It's a commercial business. We as a government, we don't feel that we need to help them in creating value. I think they're quite good in it already. It's not one of our priority areas. It's really much more the other businesses who are using it to their own.
Okay, well, let's go then more broadly and focus now on algorithmic transparency and AI ethics and so on. Google farcically attempted to set up its AI ethics board. It lasted all of 10 minutes before it completely collapsed because it wasn't very ethical. So what areas are you looking at more broadly in terms of AI monitoring and thinking about potential rules, guidelines, and regulations?
Well, first of all, we think that a very important step which was made are the ethical guidelines of the high-level group on AI in Europe. On two ways. First of all, we really recognize that you need ethics in AI to reap really the full potential benefits of AI and to get people to use it. I mean, we're talking about reducing health costs by using AI, but then we have to use the medical data. So that's really mentally a very big step for people, and I think for everybody in the room, at least it should be a very big step to go there. We can talk about that AI should be ethical, but then we also should help companies to be ethical. So we believe and we stimulate Dutch companies to use the guidelines, and we have some companies who also test them. And we have to learn from the application of the AI guidelines. It's not just talking about being ethical, but also is it doable for the companies, for European businesses to apply that, and which dilemmas do they cause, and how are we going to review that. So in that sense, we really support the Commission's initiative on this, and the Commission work on this. But we think also that there is a need of also explainability of AI and algorithm. And how we don't know yet, but we see that for the next coming years to becoming an issue, and with all new initiatives, we have to realize how is this going to work for explainability. And I think the health sector is a very good example because it's so evident that we want their AI, but it's also for other sectors very important. So if we're going to set up a program targeted on health and AI or something else in AI, we should, as a government and helping also companies reflect, okay, what are the implications for explainability and how can we really ensure that we live up to these to the ethical standards, and if we can't live up, okay, what's the problem behind it? This is not settled in 1 year or in half a year. I think we will need to reflect and we'll have a lot of discussions also on it.
I mean, when it comes to ethics and AI, it does very much again depend on what sort of AI we're talking about. I mean, okay, Spotify might give me a song I don't like, which is fine, but if I get the wrong medical treatment, that's quite a lot more serious. So, I mean, when we talk about ethics, aren't we talking about the levels of risk? And as humans, we're very bad at assessing risk, actually. So, I mean, I wonder how useful are ethics if we try to apply blanket ethics, Mark, without assessing what the value is or what the dangers are. I know your answer is maybe a bit complex, but...
Well, and maybe the more productive next step to it's complicated is we're actually not that bad at solving complicated problems or complex problems as humans. And certainly these big innovation engines of these companies are not that bad at that either. So where do we dig in on the ethics question and deal with some of the complexity, which, as you say, it's not going to happen in half a year. And I think things like the terrorist content and the broader content kind of sets of questions are a good kind of canary in the coal mine, which is, you know, getting to simplistic one size fits all answers probably isn't going to solve the problem. But having more, I mean, there's this phrase in the kind of explainability part of the AI debate about having humans in the loop as an engineering principle. And I mean, it's similar, we talk about it in that content piece, like, do we have enough moderators with the right language? And it's a very narrow example, but I think we're going to have to look at it in these ethical dilemmas. How do the people who are building and making money off these systems have engineers and product managers who have ethics training? And maybe the role of governments is, do we have a pipeline of people in society who, when they go to computer science or they go to the things that would lead them into these companies, the ethics training is really heavily integrated into that. And so going down the path, I think building a system where we're asking these questions at every step of the way is really going to be critical. In the same way that, like, we didn't expect people to have safety in mind when they were designing cars, in the 30s or 40s or 50s, but it becomes now normal and expectation, not only that the companies are responsible for safety, but that as you develop different innovations, that you adapt your idea of safety and frankly give people trained and accountable to think about safety and building automobiles. So I think the building the ability to ask ethical questions into the system is a big part of it. And then, of course, there is an accountability piece, and that's probably more the role of government. And a lot of that, which I think we really don't touch in the guidelines, can come from existing law. And we have human rights laws, we have GDPR, we have things we actually can use for accountability without, to get started on some of these ethical questions without necessarily having regulation.
I mean, in the environment sector, we have the so-called precautionary principle. I mean, something like that work for AI.
Well, I think something like the precautionary principle probably is contextual, right? Do I need the precautionary principle for Spotify? I don't know, maybe. I mean, at some level, if we think about the destruction of, the music industry by AIs who target, write songs and target people, at some level, I guess that could be this side effect, but we probably don't really need the precautionary principle for Spotify. Do we need it in healthcare? Because we actually have it in, not only in the environment, but we have it in medical and in the pharmaceutical industry. Probably, yeah.
Well, you have a background as an engineer. We often hear engineers ask, can they build it, not whether should they build it.
No, I mean, I think actually I like the way that this conversation is going, because I think that it's actually something, first of all, to realize that this is not necessarily a new new thing. Like, I mean, I studied physics, and we had a course on nuclear weapons, and there was an ethical thing. There was, things, like, don't build a bomb, right? I mean, like and there was you can kill a lot of people with this, right? And so it was, and it was kind of, it was framed in a way also that the people, in the Second World War, they had a kind of, like Einstein's letters and so on. It's just not a new thing, right? And then it happens elsewhere as well. I mean, healthcare is actually a great example, and that's one of the messages I wanted to bring. I love the framing in this report, the health framing, and because I think that it actually opens us to, our minds to other solutions elsewhere. Whether they're translatable one by one is a different question, but I think that pharmaceuticals is an interesting thing, and actually you just couldn't mention explainability in AI, And my prejudice is that we don't really understand the majority of medicines that are on the market, but we don't need to have them explained necessarily, but instead we have pre-market testing and post-market surveillance, so we have, those are things that we can learn from. So, it might not be possible to explain every algorithm in the same way that not every medicine is necessarily explainable, and we don't know, but we have testing protocols in place, and in some areas this is an interesting way of proceeding. We have in genetics research, ethical screening and testing is got decades of experience. This is something that we should learn from. Like what, and it doesn't mean that we have kind of completely. So, and sometimes it has led to a prohibition, and sometimes not. And all this talk around CRISPR, genome editing, this is all framed in what I perceive from a distance as robust frameworks, that we can borrow from,
and refine. What I don't see so much happening is that the AI ethics conversation is talking to those people to do a cross-sector learning. I think this is something that we could stimulate much more. So just to give a few examples, of when this might be going. I totally agree with the distinction that you made between trivial applications. If I autocomplete on my text message to my daughter, it doesn't require the same regulatory scrutiny as death row prediction. And so this needs to be factored in somehow. And we try to do this. Bearers of fundamental rights responsibilities, particularly governments who are directly duty bearers on fundamental rights, they need to be held to a very high standard in when they use AI for and I think they are, and people who are have technical knowledge to inspect and scrutinize the systems, they need to be given access. One of the things I wanted to say on your previous point about political ads, just is a the Mozilla proposal for the API and criteria for something to work resonated with inside the commission hugely, because why? Because it was actually set as it was seen as a kind of neutral standard that was proposed by somebody who understands the technology, but it gives teeth to something that is very difficult for us to come up with in between the dialogue between regulators who are generally not so tech savvy and the industry who sometimes we suspect is running us around circles, in some of these issues, and so having a constructive proposal that outlines the middle ground immediately leads to a lot of resonance. Same on explainability and AI. If there are neutral people in the middle who can actually come up with meaningful ways of providing reassurances, testing, explainability, to a degree that doesn't kind of immediately outlaw recommendation systems or something like that, then that's something that really will take us, for as part of the conversation. So I think this is the right approach, I think, but I think it also requires a lot more conversations, a lot more cross disciplinary conversations, and a lot more focused conversations. And we'll certainly be very happy to have some of those going forward.
And one of the, to stay with the health analogy, one of the ideas I always like to mention is the data donor card, where like an organ donor card, where you can say, hey, use my data if it's helping to solve cancer, but don't use my data if it's just writing country western songs. I'm going to open it up to the floor. I know already Isabel has a question. Has anyone else got some comments or issues they'd like us to raise? Let me know. Okay, well, Isabel, what's up?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Isabel. I represent the German Consumer Organization here in Brussels. I also wanted to jump on the API example, actually. I think it's a nice analogy to use medication, because there is an explainability element in there. If you look at the leaflets, it tells you roughly what it is used for, what you should not use it for, and how you should consume medication in that sense. So the side effects and all of that. And you have clinical trials, you have pre-market authorization, you have lots of testing, but you have one thing is every laboratory can take it apart, take the pill. You can basically deconstruct it and see what the dosage is and so on. And I think this was the point about the API. We cannot do that so easily if everything is treated as a trade secret, or if everything is supposed to be proprietary, company secrets, business models, and all of that. I think that's going to be the hard ball that we need to talk about ultimately. Ethics is fine. Ethics is super important, and we need to have a societal debate of where the red lines are, where we want algorithm decision to maybe not be applied. But it's not going to be enough, because ethics you can already apply today. If you Google and you have the money to do it, it's no problem to train your technologists on that already now and to have some internal rules. But as has been demonstrated on the political ads part, it is not being done, and they don't want anyone else, be it governments, be it other third parties, scientists, to take the pill apart. And this is not going to be done with ethical guidelines. So what else should we then do? This is a question clearly for you, but maybe also you have some more ideas going beyond the API, the properly designed API.
This is going to be for all the three subjects we were talking today. I wrote down next to them numbers, research numbers, transparency. It's kind of pervasive, isn't it, this question of taking the pill apart.
No, sure. I mean, I don't have a kind of solid answer to your question in the sense that, if I had it, I would have proposed it. But I think that I'm not totally sure that I agree with your analogy. I think that I think actually my prejudice is that the pharmaceutical industry isn't all that transparent and is not all that is all not all that easily copyable or verifiable. There are lots of issues at stake around intellectual property and so on. And so. But at the same time, I think that I want to just also do justice that a lot of AI development has been done based on open source technologies. A lot of tools are out on GitHub, and there's actually, we don't want to kind of dismiss the efforts that a lot of the people in the AI community have made to share tools, share data sets, share best practices, and also share limitations of the technologies. And that's true for the big companies as well as the grassroots movement. So my starting point is actually that the intrinsic desire for accountability is actually a little bit higher in the AI community than I think in the pharmaceutical sector. That's just a kind of starting point. Maybe it's not I hope I'm not being filmed by saying that. But anyway,
You are.
The microphone's over here.
But it's just a personal prejudice, of course, not a position. And I'm happy to be correct. And that's that. I just want to do justice to this. The fact that you can actually come with a proposal for API means that actually there are interfaces available and oversight techniques available that aren't so easily available elsewhere. I think that, and this is also something that I think is valuable to pick up on the report, is that a lot of the times the avenues for solutions revolve around technology as a vector for accountability also of technology itself. I think this is something that it's not only a regulation and a law and a 1 hour takedown. It's also about creating a set of tools and a set of browser plugins or Haystacks doing great work on privacy and the mobile ecosystem. And those kind of things. The measurements that actually create an awareness of what's going on, how your cookies are being used. And this is, I think, a very valuable avenue. So I think that I just want to kind of, I think that the mechanisms of transparency, and that's maybe the difference between pharmaceuticals and AI are not exactly the same. My understanding of deep learning algorithms are that the way that weights are being taught is intrinsically difficult to understand. The training data plays a big role, and kind of data sheets for data sets, and the kind of dietary nutrition labels for data sets. Those are all great ideas. And I think that when I saw them being demonstrated, I think yes, we need more of those. But I don't individually believe that they have just cut it right. I just don't. But they are going in the right direction. This is an area where we need to stimulate much more grassroots kind of activism. So there are ideas emerging. I think the digital industry has something powerful that it has actually, internet history has self-standardized in the IETF and those kind of forums, early on, and somehow that has gone missing a little bit. My kind of aspiration would be is that we kind of return to kind of this consensus-driven standardization, which is very open and transparent and kind of inclusive, but also on some of those issues. What are the data standards that we need to make AI accountable? And if that works, I think that actually responds to a lot of the concerns about whether you need regulation or not. But there is a suspicion that increasingly by a lot of people that it won't happen just by itself in the way that it perhaps happened in the early 90s, when protocols were being standardized.
I mean, just to slightly broaden this a little bit, as a term that goes here is, transparency is great, having the numbers are great, but we also need to know what do those numbers mean, because understanding what's behind is actually much more complex. You say, okay, so 80 terrorist videos were taken down this month. Last month, 90 were taken down. Is that good or is that bad? Because causation and correlation are not the same thing. is taking down more bad things better, or is it because there are fewer problems out there? In the same way that just pure transparency, I'm going to say sunlight isn't the best disinfectant, but it's not great if you don't really know why it's working. Both of you.
Well, I think this is one of the points where ethics gets a bit more difficult, and where we are maybe a little bit more pessimistic. We see two things that, and one thing which might even be underestimated is that there's a lack of trust in AI. And this lack of trust in AI is also, and you actually wrote this in your report, because much of what happens is unseen. So we really, if AI is used, we just have to trust it or somebody, we even don't know whether it's it or somebody. And therefore, we try to keep on stressing, especially to the businesses, why this ethics, and this ethics is a big word, but it's starting with the design, by the use of your data, by the use of the people who need to be qualified and need understanding. It's really, when you build up AI, every step needs to be done in a very thoughtful way, and then applying all you can do to prevent any mistakes, and these mistakes can be biases or whatever. And we need that, and I think it's sometimes a bit underestimated that, okay, we just have to, it's not just about transparency, but it's more the whole structure needs to be good, because if it's there, it's very difficult to see, first to detect whether there's something wrong, and then to see, okay, what happened wrong. And that's what I think people notice from AI. Can I trust it? Is it safe? Can I use it? And we also believe that over time we get more used to it, and we want. We get used to it and we find our ways out. But I think if you want to be globally competitive, it would be good to be leading in this. And therefore, we need to take the ethics. And I do agree a little bit. I'm sorry, but with Isabel, that in health, of course, it is important, but in all kinds of AI we apply, it's important to have the basics right. Even with Spotify, at least, maybe you don't need the 100%, but you at least need the 90-95 should be correct, because it could. I don't want to miss out music because my the algorithm says no, you don't like country. Maybe I like country. I don't know. So it's and we need to trust of the users to. I think where Europe could be really great in is in the application of AI. And if you want to apply AI, you need also people to use it. So it's yes. I think for the Netherlands we're a little bit more pessimistic, and we are really trying to stress more and more really about ethics is just not like following some guidelines or just following regulation, but just really designing it from the start. Great job.
I think it's great design.
And exactly.
Right, final thoughts from you on AI.
Well, I think, and maybe this is even what you mean, but to move from pessimism, I think a lot of us have, or be caution, from pessimism to being demanding. And to being demanding of that level of transparency and that level of ethics, and to being demanding in the specifics. And so I think with the drug, maybe we're going to blow this drug analogy apart by overextending it, but when we look at that, it's specific drug. You have to look at what is that drug trying to do? What are the possible side effects? What is the population likely to use it? All of that sets of questions. And I think the way to get to these questions around whether it's explainability, whether it's ethics, whether it's how the accountability between the two works, is going to be to look at specific uses of AI. And so not maybe the people who wrote a bunch of the libraries behind the YouTube recommendation algorithm had all kinds of great open intent and characterize humanity, but it's an adaptive system. And frankly, it is maybe where we need to worry about Spotify, because the YouTube recommendation algorithm is basically the same thing. And what's the end effect of that? Possibly that we have outbreaks of measles, which may be alarmist, but we know that that algorithm is trying to get people to stay on the site as long as possible. We know that radical content is something that keeps people on sites. We know that's the set of business rules given to the algorithm. And so being able to understand that and observe it, and then to be demanding, I think that relationship between being able to see transparency in a real way, like how the human subject, which are us, and then the living drug, which is those algorithms, we can actually see that, and then to be demanding, we need to dig into specific cases. And I would say, I love your call for more activism, that the consumer movement is hopefully a really big ally in being demanding in that way.
Yeah, I don't think there's any other questions in the minutes. Oh yeah, one quickly.
Hi, sorry to keep everyone here. Chris Sherwood from the OLX Group. We're an online classifieds platform company. I wanted to come back to content moderation. And I remember hearing a few days ago a UK minister on the radio presenting the new UK proposal for a liability regime for intermediaries. And he said in the same breath, we need companies like Facebook to have more liability for the illegal content that's on the platforms, and we can't have Mark Zuckerberg making the rules. And it struck me that it's extraordinary that people don't see the contradiction there. How what do you think is the approach that how can we get more kind of responsibility without making Mark Zuckerberg or giving Mark Zuckerberg the power to make the rules? Is it the more process oriented approach that you were describing? How do we do that?
I think that's the starting point. There's probably a bigger answer is we don't know yet, right? Like, we built these incredibly complex systems that organize a lot of our lives, a lot of what information we get, how, to some degree, how we think, and we both have a thing like the values-based rules that we could go from, like human rights or privacy, more particularly in GDPR. But like how we actually work with that system, I don't think we know. So I think the process-oriented piece is one part of it. But when you look at something as expansive as what the UK has come out with, which are bits of it that are good and lots of it that are scary, like digging in and actually trying to answer that question and going slow enough to do it closer to right, and then building it as something that is adaptive and involving people with real technical knowledge from different sides of the equation. I think that's what, to us, I think the thing would be like, slow down and let's look at this set of questions, as opposed to just rush to a new regulatory paradigm or the academic
Okay, I think that really well. So my question then to the audience: how many of you would allow an algorithm to make a major decision in your life?
How many of you don't right now?
How many of you have already this morning in some capacity or another?
We don't know.
Many of you? Yeah. Okay. Kind of different responses for those questions. So I think I'm going to leave it at that. There's no point to those questions, just to make you think. And I always quote Kranzberg's first law, which is technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. So, please join me in thanking our guests, and we will put out on Twitter when the next Mozilla Mornings is very soon.
Yeah,
So,